And we really, really appreciate it. It's a very busy time of term, which we can all attest to. So we're very appreciative of you taking the time to join our final event in the IU Ethics, Values, and Technology series dedicated to cybersecurity. And I can think of no better way to wind this up than with the all-star cast that we've assembled from around campus today to tell us a little bit about their cybersecurity research, especially that pertaining to a lot of vexing national security issues. So the plan for today is to start with some quick introductions. Then we'll turn to each speaker in turn for some opening remarks about some of their current research areas. And then from there, turn, of course, to your questions, along with some questions that we circulated in advance. So per usual with these types of things, feel free to use the question and answer feature to help load those questions at any point if you so choose. And then you can let me know if you have anything else by raising hands or etc. So that is the game plan for the next 57 minutes at any rate. And we're still waiting on one of our panelists to connect. I think there were just some technical difficulties there, but I'm sure Jean will be joining us shortly. But to start things off, I'll just briefly introduce those who are on the line. So first off, of course, Diane Hinchel. Has been, made a career here in various areas actually related to cybersecurity, beginning in environmental risk though, and doing a really interesting pivot to, show the cross-pollination, frankly, of these fields, I think in some really exciting ways, including now even on the teaching front to kind of dig into some elements of environmental risk and sustainable development and applying that to cybersecurity. Professor Henshel is an expert in all sorts of different aspects of risk assessment, including in the sublethal health effects of environmental pollutants, and of course, as we've been describing now more recently, cyber risk. She serves on a number of boards and panels and advisory committees for agencies, including the U.S.-Canada International Joint Commission, the EPA, and the National Research Council. So Diane, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. This is fantastic. Great to see you. And then next up, we have Professor Sagar Samtani, who is a new and wonderful hire. I'm so glad we got you, Sagar, to join the IU faculty here. Has a wide range of expertise in AI for cybersecurity, cyber threat intelligence, deep learning, smart vulnerability assessment, IoT, dark web analytics, cybersecurity and mobile health analytics, just to name a few areas. He is teaching widely now in cyber and AI and is incredibly research active, winning a number of awards and honors, including the National Science Foundation grant for AI and cybersecurity, and a number of other recent both Best Paper Awards and runner-up Best Paper Awards. So congratulations on all your successes, Sagar, and thank you for joining us. We can't wait to hear about your research as well. And then second to last but not least here, Professor Asaf Lubin, also a relatively new hire now. Asaf, we've done a lot since joining the IU faculty in a pretty short amount of time. Professor Lubin is an affiliated fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society project, where we got him from, a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and a visiting scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And his research interests lay at the intersection of law and technology, particularly as it relates to the regulation of cybersecurity harms, liabilities, insurance, as well as policy design around governmental and corporate surveillance, data protection, and internet governance. The easy stuff, in other words. And Professor Lubin is quite prolific, frankly, in these areas, not only cyber risk insurance, intelligence, you name it. So a number of interesting intersections to explore there as well. And I don't think we have Jean yet. So when Jean joins, I will properly introduce Professor Jean Camp from Luddy as well. But perhaps we'll just get rolling in the interest of time. And I'm wondering, Diane, if it's okay, perhaps we could start with you and welcome. Oh, Jean is here. I'm so sorry. Jean is here, but perhaps not one of the. Okay, we're going to figure this out, guys. Okay, so but welcome, very much welcome, Professor Jean Camp, a world-leading authority on cybersecurity for many years now, based at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering, and director of the Center for Security and Privacy in Informatics, Computing and Engineering. Spice, a fantastic center at Luddy. So we're very, very fortunate to have you join us as well, Gene. And I'm sorry that we're dealing with some technical challenges here, but we're going to get that sorted. Okay, but maybe Diane, if it's okay, we'll start with you and any introductory remarks that you might have about some of your current research in cybersecurity and as it pertains to national security, and we'll go around the horn from there before turning to some discussion questions.
So from a thinking about a scale system where we have multiple scales of organization, I kind of fit in between the people that are here and participating. So a lot of the work that I've done has been in cybersecurity risk and modeling cybersecurity risk, understanding where the vulnerabilities are within a given system, but more importantly, within the larger frame of, please resend, within the larger frame of overall multi-system situations, which is what we've turned into. So if you think about your life and you think about what's happened, some people are younger, some people are older, but go back in time. And we had computers, then we had computers that were controlling different aspects and of our life, but we were still mostly controlling the computers. And then computers got more and more artificial intelligence and more capabilities to run things. And because it's so nice to be able to sit at home or sit from a distance and be able to like zoom in through the internet and control something, more and more systems, both building systems, the electrical grid, for example, are controlled from a distance through the internet. And unfortunately, over this period of time, the same 20 to 30, I'd say 20 to 30 years of this, you know, starting with a small wedge and then moving into taking over our lives, we now have cyber systems that control virtually all aspects of society. I would have said that from a social control perspective, thinking from an environmental perspective as well, the last big one that I would have thought was being held out was water systems. And what do you know, water systems are now cyber controlled too. And we really don't have any aspects of our lives that aren't cyber controlled. And this is even going to be more of an issue as more and more people buy cars that have more and more AI built into the cars. And to help maintain safety, they are going to be built into the transportation grid. And now you're going to be driving cars that are also going to be controlled from a distance. So that I'm going to leave to like Asaf or somebody else to talk about. And I'm going to go to the kind of risk pieces of this. And my concerns about this are that there's all these vulnerabilities, and when you look at the way cybersecurity risk is evaluated, it tends to be evaluated from a single system perspective, a single company, a single, you know, isolated segment perspective. But in fact, what's happened is we have thousands and thousands of interacting systems, and some of them are more capable of handling cybersecurity and in fact have more bandwidth to vet either cybersecurity systems or automated agents to do cybersecurity for them. And some of them, like the IoT, have very little bandwidth and yet are hooked into the bigger systems and yet have almost no bandwidth in which to install or handle any of the cybersecurity capabilities. So for example, if you were to try to build cybersecurity into an IoT that has almost no bandwidth as it is, then any cybersecurity monitoring you build into it will take up the bandwidth, and now your IoT has to totally change and be more like a regular computer. And that's not happening yet because it's going to increase cost, among other things. Then the second piece of all of this that everyone should be concerned about, but nobody is that the biggest, weakest link, I think, in all of this is always going to be humans, because no matter how many protections we built into a system, even the most automated of systems that people are working on at this point still have to have human oversight. And so again, even the best of the systems, there's always going to be an issue of human oversight, and humans have a problem in that humans look at things from a very narrow, what I've seen in the past little while perspective, and the best of the threats are the advanced persistent threats type people are very patient, and they understand that people are looking for patterns and changes in patterns, and therefore they know to go into a system, sit quietly, just like the huge hacks that Russia did that took a long time to get caught, but finally got caught, and just move a little bit sporadically when they think nobody is watching. And they do not have to go in with a pattern because they're not necessarily automated, or they can have human control over the automated vetting of what's going on there. And we don't have enough in our models yet to fully understand the human vulnerabilities associated with this from either the defender or the attacker or the user, because the user is the biggest vulnerability in all of this. And I think Jean will probably talk about that when she's here. Hi, Jean. The second biggest problem that I see and that I'm trying to work out is the problem of the interfaces. And this is where almost nobody is working at this point, unfortunately. And I think that it's a place where everybody needs to be working, because it's the point of interface that we have the biggest problems. Number one, at the point of interface is the biggest vulnerability, because somebody could insert themselves there at the easiest point. We already know that internally to systems, we know the points of vulnerability are those intersection points where people insert themselves. So imagine when you're going from, for example, the electrical grid, which grant you, Russia has a really great handle on almost everybody's electrical grid and could inject themselves into anybody's at this point, I think. But look at the electrical grid and how it overlaps, for example, just with the water systems that are now unfortunately getting more and more automated. And you could control what's happening just not with the electrical, but also with water by controlling the electrical flow to the different components of the water, as an example. So we have this problem of having too many people that are very engineering focused and looking very narrowly down within systems to be able to model them. And yet we have a technology that is being heralded and jumped up on because it's got all these capabilities, let's explore them. And as humans, we have this amazing tendency to say, let's try it before checking all the, how do we protect ourselves before then? And we've gotten to the point now where we have a society throughout at least 3 continents, if not more, that are probably fully vulnerable to anybody that seriously wants to hack in. And we need to rethink whether we want to leave ourselves fully open like this. And I think at this point you should go to Asaf, because that's a really good takeoff to him. Am I right, Asaf? That's kind of where you go next.
Certainly. No, we could change the order and do that. That's fine. But first off, thank you so much, Diane. It's such a wonderful overview. Very much appreciated. And with that handoff, sure, Asaf, if you would like to go next, that would be fine. And then we can turn to Jean and Sagar.
Sure thing, and I do think there's a lot of overlap. So let me start by saying, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And what I thought I'll highlight as far as my research is concerned is really the intersectionality between ethics, national security, and technology in 2 particular areas. One is below the threshold, and one is above the threshold, with the threshold being uses of force. So let me start with below the threshold, and Diane had already touched on the Russian SolarWinds hack. I think that's a perfect segue. When I was 18, I joined the Israeli intelligence, and I worked for them as an analyst for about 5 years. And one of the first things I did with the Israeli intelligence was going through an intelligence training course. And many of my friends from high school went to combat units, and they were getting their own training. And their training involved a lot of ethical discussion about what it means to use firearms, rules of engagement, what it means to kill a person. And they would come back over the weekends. They would tell us their conversations from their boot camp. And I found it really odd because no one was giving us any training about the ethics of spying on someone. what it means to gather information on a person, rules of engagement, and so on. So I went to my commander at the time, I was 18, and I asked him, why is it that we were not having any conversation about the ethics of what we were doing? And he started laughing. He said to me, you're kidding, right? Spying is about lying and cheating and deceiving. There's nothing ethical about spying. Spying is antithetical to ethics. And for the next 5 years of my work there, I don't recall a single conversation about ethics or law, for that matter. Kind of accepted the cloak and dagger nature of the profession and allowed ourselves to be fully succumb to the occupational therapy that comes from puzzle piecing in the intelligence realm. But for the next 10 years after that, I've devoted my research only to the question of how do we think about the ethics of intelligence and espionage. And I've realized that there's actually a body of literature that is rooted in what is known as just intelligence that tries to ask, how do we conceive of ethical rules for intelligence collection? So you might think about 3 operations, SolarWinds being one of them, a classic cyber espionage operation. Let me name 2 others. One is Neptune Spear, which was the operation to capture Osama bin Laden. In the lead up to it, the CIA put a couple of its men in a Shem hepatitis B vaccination program to gather DNA information about the neighborhood in which they believed Osama bin Laden was. The program was completely failed. And the result was that after it was discovered, families refused to vaccinate their children for the polio vaccine because they thought all these vaccinations were a Western hoax. On the other hand of the spectrum, the CIA has since apologized and claimed they will never again engage in any covert activity involving medical units. On the other hand of the spectrum, think about Operation Rubicon, which began after World War II, in which US and German intelligence collaborated to create a Swiss company called Crypto AG that sold encryption technologies with backdoors built into them to all kinds of adversaries and allies, and in the process also deceived and exploited hundreds of unwitting Crypto AG employees. Where in the spectrum, which the US still defends and thinks it was a great operation that collected a lot of terrific intelligence, where between the spectrum between Operation Rubicon and Operation Neptune Spear should we put SolarWinds? Is it because of its scale and effects, because it's a supply chain attack, because of Russia's prior reckless history, because of the undue burden of the private sector, that we should put it closer to Neptune Spear, or should we put it closer to Crypto AG? And that's the kind of questions that fascinate me. Where do we draw questions of proportionality, necessity, adequate safeguards, and trying to design ethical frameworks for cyber and non-cyber espionage operations? So that's on the one side of my research, and I'd be more than happy if that triggers anyone in the audience for further discussion to have that. The second part of my research is the above the threshold ethics and national security, which is when we have a war. And in particular, I'm interested about the intersectionality between data ethics and wartime ethics. So Israel, as a belligerent occupier in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, required Palestinians last year to download an app called El Munasik, which is Arabic for the coordinator, which provided them, which just the name, by the way, is so Big Brother-esque. That is interesting that they chose that name, but allow them to gain full access to the phones of those Palestinians who are interested to enter into Israel to work. That is then was combined with other technologies that Israel routinely uses, like CCTV cameras and facial recognition and AI and automated checkpoints. And the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, the rules of the laws of war, say nothing about what to do in these contexts. There are no regulations established specifically to address the legality or illegality, morality or lack thereof of data collection, data analysis, data processing, automated decision-making, the right to delete, the right to challenge, all these things that we consider privacy, data protection, and data ethics in the context of war. Because the Geneva Conventions were created in 1949 at a time where none of this was in play. And so the question becomes, to what extent should we have regulations of privacy and data protection and cybersecurity in the context of wartime activities of various sorts? And I chose belligerent occupation and administration of belligerent occupation to demonstrate not just the obvious cyber attacks or the use of killer robots, which I think are commonly cited in the literature, but actually the kind of things that people don't talk about all that often. And I'll just end with mentioning that, so together with my colleague, Russell Buchan from the University of Sheffield, we are co-editing a book for the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, the CCDCOE, with support from the Ostrom Workshop, which we greatly appreciate, which looks to bring together both data protection specialists and wartime specialists and wartime lawyers to have conversations that they never had before. And I think that that is a really exciting thing.
It's incredibly exciting, Asif. But again, I'm biased. I'm so glad you're taking on that project, though, and hopefully, you know, finally, we've been trying to do this for a while. By next summer, anyway, we can actually physically go to SciCon and Talon, indeed, and hopefully feature some of this great work. So, thank you. And then I'm so glad you're able to join us, Gene. So sorry again for the technical difficulties there. And if you're ready to go, we'll turn to you next.
I'm not part of the Lilly grant, so I'm funding work. So I'm going to talk about work that's funded by the NSA and the Army. And my essential argument is that ethical machine learning is better engineering. And I want to make that point with a couple of examples and a couple of large-scale observations. I too reference solar wind. We know how we're using ML wrong. Everybody here should have read Stochastic Parrots, right? So we assume correctness, inadequate review upon failure. We're constantly accepting human error as an excuse for systematic failure. If every human makes the same error, it's a design flaw. And that is risk shifting that is essentially unethical. We are creating risk and we are creating systematic cascading failures. A lot of discussion has been done about the lack of diversity and the ways that it impinges racism and sexism. It's also just bad engineering. And it's bad engineering that we see in security. So my essential point is that what we really need to do for ethical machine learning is to curate, not exfiltrate. Attackers in SolarWinds went undetected because they logged in from the same cities and time zones. The attack was discovered by local human intelligence. It was not discovered by large-scale ML and AI systems, because when you expand the data, you lose the nuance. So I think the classic observation you get here, are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes, we sure are.
You're seeing the hay bales, right?
Yes.
Very Indiana, you're seeing hay bales. All right. The failure to curate data resulted in a system that couldn't leverage any kind of local homophily, but it looked at gross correlations. So this is like, we're trying to find the needles, we're increasing the size of the haystack, and we're creating these massive amounts of data that are more valuable for attackers than for defenders. That when we talk about security being the enemy of privacy, often bad security is the enemy of privacy. That the business models we have now of data exfiltration to profit are essentially in conflict with security. I feel that when we look at the way we build systems, we need, thank goodness, we have, as a computer scientist, I can say this, real scientists like Diane engaging in this, because we are not building systems that collapse around the user. You subvert a system, it continues to work wonderfully, right? We're building computers like we used to build cars. You could wreck a car, the person would be completely horribly dead. The only thing wrong with the car is the windshield and it needs to be cleaned. We need to think about graceful degradation and what we're really trying to protect. If you try to protect everything, you're not going to protect anything. We also, because of the way we conceptualize of security is that security is creating risk. Several CSOs have observed after SolarWinds that there is no way for them to know who can change their Windows 95 or Linux environments, right? Other people can update code on your system, read and exfiltrate your data, decide how much of your visibility on your threat analysis you get to see, right? How much do you get to know about your own house today? And decide what is transparent. So the homogeneity we have in defense is an unethical and bad engineering use of big data. That is my fundamental argument I want to make here. And privacy offers the ability to build global resistance, that local data are not equivalent to global data, and that when we really respect individual autonomy and human autonomy, we can create better systems. I think I'm going to drop this, maybe 3 more slides, and I'm happy to provide these. We need to do a better job of respecting human intelligence and not dismissing human operators. And we need to build systems that respect human autonomy. And when you look at a lot of security weaknesses, the reason that you're experiencing these weaknesses is because we're assuming insane things about humans, and we're assuming humans are wrong and stupid, and then we tell them to get a job done and they avoid security to get the job done. We are putting people in impossible situations and then blaming them and firing them for failing. So this is, my ethical perspective. And so what does that mean? If you look at phishing solutions right now, how do you deal with phishing? You get trained, your own employer attacks you, and your browser reports on you. But neither really helps you at all, right? And we're using these massive data sets. We're not personalizing, and so we cannot distinguish the unknown from the trusted. We can't communicate it, and we can't mitigate it. My general observation in this case is it's easier to poison a shared data source. We know our data sources are poisoned. So I have a couple of slides about my work in progress. These are 3 views of a web page with a toolbar that we've built that uses local information and blocks unfamiliar sources. So it's trivially easy to see that this is not actually this. We had people use it for a month. It changed their exposure to unknown risks. They also hit a couple of phishing sites and they identified those correctly. We did a larger test in the lab and found that the highest setting and both the lowest setting were much better at detecting risk and identifying phishing sites. So ML for security, if you want to be ethical, be careful. Curate data, understand why you're doing what you're doing, learn from human failures, don't blame humans, really reevaluate what you're doing. Periodically recreate factors and weights, and above all, support human decision making. And humans are not all the same. We have this phishing resilience study across 5 countries. Whoa, the things that drive accuracy and risk perception. I put up the US, the UK, and the Canadian. The Australian is so unbelievable, I didn't include it in here. They're like things that are negative that are never negative. The only sane people in the world are from New Zealand. That's what I have concluded from this phishing experiment. So how do you create data to address specific attacks? And how do you support local human decision making? Because I think autonomy and privacy are core ethical issues in security. And I have my own argument for how to do this. Leverage local homophily and local knowledge, limit risk introduced by security technology, stop thinking we're, so perfect ourselves, enable local review, embrace errors as indicators for review, and create diversity in defense. But really, this is an unsolved question. I mean, I can tell you part of the answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. What a tour de force. That was fantastic. I love the variety, but also the common threads that I think we're seeing come up in several of these different contexts. Around, for example, building trust across these distributed systems, IoT issues that we're going to return to, and of course, some overarching ethical concerns driving a lot of this. And I think this is a wonderful bridge, actually, Sagar, to some of your work around cybersecurity and AI. So without further ado, perhaps we could turn to you next. And then just as a reminder, we'll turn to your questions along with several that we've discussed in advance. So please, Sagar.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Really appreciate the invitation. It's a little bit of imposter syndrome coming in right now, being one of the most junior people with so many distinguished panelists here as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a slide that Jean actually had, and that's a nice segue into my research overview. The ML for security part, I'll talk about that more in particular, and I'll talk about kind of the initiatives from the national scale, and then how does that feed into my research. So increasingly, the National Science Foundation, NSTC, the National Academies of Sciences are noting that cybersecurity is a significant issue within society today. I don't think that that's too much of a surprise, but what we're seeing more and more is the question coming up about what is the role of artificial intelligence for cybersecurity applications. And there's kind of two sides of the coin for this. One is, how do you deploy AI-based methodologies, machine learning, network science, deep learning, et cetera, for cybersecurity applications? But then on the flip side of it is, how do you ensure the cybersecurity of AI-based systems? So a lot of AI systems have vulnerabilities within them, data poisoning issues, so on and so forth, that we really need to think about cybersecurity for. The angle I'm coming from is more on AI for cybersecurity applications, wherein you have cybersecurity and there is a lot of different data sources that are available within the context of cybersecurity. And I broadly categorize them into internal to an organization and external to an organization. Internal to an organization are your typical NetFlow, log files, malware analysis, those types of things. Those are the types of data that's typically within an organization. And then also external to an organization, which is things that exist within the dark web, surface web, social media, and so on, that are typically used for contexts such as disinformation analysis, dark web analysis, and so on. And I know that here at IU, we have the IU Social Media Observatory and so many different initiatives around disinformation identification and propagation and so on and so forth. So the National Science Foundation, NAS, NSTC have all noted that this is a significant area of focus for them from a national priority point of view. And I actually presented at the NSF SFS PI meeting yesterday, the Scholarship for Service meeting yesterday. And the SFS program is designed to help train the next generation of cybersecurity professionals for eventual placement to government and those types of positions. And the question that came up was, how do we inject artificial intelligence for cybersecurity knowledge into SFS curriculum such that we're training the next generation of cyber warriors? So I think that if I kind of look at what the landscape looks like right now, where does my research fit into that? There's been a lot of work that's been applying existing AI ML-based techniques. That's not my dog.
Yeah. Sorry, we got it. I think
Awesome.
it was David's. Sorry about that.
No problem. Now I just want to see the dog. So, but there's been a lot of work that's been doing, applying AI and ML for cybersecurity applications. There's four major areas that they've been applied in. One has been in the context of cyber threat intelligence, doing APT analysis and those types of things. Another one has been in the area of disinformation, computational propaganda, election security, social media analytics around that, and so on. Third is security operations centers, which is focused on a lot of vulnerability management, log file analysis and so on. And the final one is like adversarial ML, which is focused on like adversarial malware evasion and generation and those types of things. But if I look at what the landscape looks like right now and kind of think about what are some of the limitations of the landscape at this point in time, is that a lot of the resources that we see within the context of AI for security, they're very siloed. So they're siloed between academia and industry. They almost always don't talk to each other in terms of sharing resources, data sets, methodologies, and so on and so forth. There are some exceptions to the rule, of course. And I think another key limitation as it pertains to the theme of this particular roundtable is a lot of AI ML is just being used out of the box for security applications. And that could have a lot of ethical implications associated with it. Fundamentally, the technologies of AI and ML that are being used and developed from the larger community, AI ML community, are not designed for cybersecurity context. They're not designed for the unique aspects that cybersecurity has as a domain, in particular thinking about how do humans respond to threats? How do Gene had that amazing view of like the New Zealanders being the best people on the planet as it comes to fishing, right? How does it respond to cultural differences and those types of things, right? So I think that there's some significant ethical concerns that fall into play when we think about how to develop ML AI for cybersecurity applications, thinking about it from a multidisciplinary approach. And where my research kind of falls into that is kind of thinking about how do we develop multimodal analysis that takes into account multiple sources of data based off of key cybersecurity requirements. And so I do a lot of analysis looking at hackers from the dark web, from multiple countries. What are the different types of threats that are coming from different countries and so on? And then also, how do they relate with different vulnerabilities that we see within advanced scientific cyber infrastructure? So I think here at IU, we have tremendous initiatives around advanced cyber infrastructure, the work that CACR is doing with scientific CIs and research SOC initiative and so on. But being able to identify what are the different threats from different parts of the globe that are targeting the vulnerabilities that we may be seeing, and using and developing AI that's carefully tuned around the domain requirements such that it's a little bit more interpretable, a little bit more explainable, a little bit more usable for end users as well. So with that, I think I hit my 3 to 5 minutes. So I think we can probably just open it up now, right?
That was fantastic. No, thank you so much, Sagar. I really, really appreciate that. And thanks again to all. As you can tell, there's just such a treasure trove of wonderful research being done on this topic around campus from lots of different disciplinary perspectives, but coming at some of these common questions in some really exciting and I think interesting ways. As a reminder to the participants, and I see a number of ringers in the participants list, I'd love to hear from you, Barb, Brandon, plenty of others. Feel free. Please do raise those questions. While we wait, I'll just turn to a couple that we had planned in advance to kind of go over together. Beginning with this overarching question of to what degree you consider, in your own research and just in your own personal opinion as well, cybersecurity as just a subset of national security, and if so, how does that help inform, frankly, our policy responses, right? So how much role should government have, for example, in setting cybersecurity benchmarks for private firms, right? We saw some news just in the last week about the active role, for example, of the FBI here. So I'm wondering, perhaps, Asif, we could turn to you first, since I know that's a topic you've thought a lot about, as I think many others on the panel. And then if others would like to jump in on that as well, Gene, of course, any others, please do.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, in part because by branding something national security for my areas of interest, you automatically are engaging in exceptionalism within the law. Law often excludes national security within existing regulation as something that is, for example, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, does not cover national security operations. And that's something that the European Court of Justice has been fighting back on. And now there's multiple initiatives led by France to try and ensure the future data protection regulations in the European continent are not covering national security agencies. And so there's an innate fear in me because obviously from a purely linguistic point of view, cybersecurity is a subset of national security. I don't think that's surprising because if to the extent that our national ecosystem is connected to the internet and is constantly becoming more and more digitized, then any threats to our national environment through the cyber means involves a threat to national security. But my worry is that by branding something a national security issue, that we would be opening ourselves up to certain limitations on the application of our existing ethical, legal, and regulatory structures. And that's something that I've been researching a lot, in particular, apropos the discussion we already had in the context of AI and the extent to which so much of our AI development currently is being done with contracting with various national security agencies. Are we excluding those kind of activities from the regulation of data protection, from the regulation of privacy, or are those still should be in line with them? And if so, how? Is something that I've been researching a lot now. And it's a complex matter for the reasons I just mentioned.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much, Asif. Yeah. And Jean, I'm not sure if you had anything you'd like to add to that, or Diane, since you're so focused on policy aspects here. I don't want to leave you out either, Sagar. But yeah, Jean, please.
I think Diane was getting ready to speak, and I'll go after her.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Oh, Diane, I'm sorry. It looks like you might still be muted. The joys of Zoom, right? Yeah, please.
Well, I think the issue is to begin with, what do you consider to be national security? So if you're defining it within this very, sorry, Asaf, narrow concept that is defined by what is controlled by the federal government, and when the federal government decrees something to be of national security concern, which is a very fluid issue these days, I think you're forgetting that national security really, in the end, means the security of the people and the security of the society. And that's a very different question when you're dealing with cybersecurity. So I would say that you need to be either define your terms better or separate this out and have different discussions based on what part of national security you're talking about. And I'd like to hear Jean's comments.
Well, I think they're well aligned with yours. It is clearly the role of national defense to protect infrastructure. But as individuals, the United States has been in war in Afghanistan for a year. And what has our role been in that, right? So I think a better metaphor for some components of cybersecurity may in fact be public health. Not that we've done great in human behavior and public health in the past year, but the past year also illustrates the importance of human behavior in public health and empowering and enabling people to act in a manner that creates safety for everyone. And so that is my primary concern about listing computer security, cybersecurity as a subcomponent of national security.
Can I also point out that your question focuses down towards private firms, and where we need cybersecurity benchmarks is really for all aspects of where cybersecurity is used and needed. And yes, the benchmarks are going to be different depending on how, the implementation. But we can't just talk about private firms when we now have municipal systems, state systems being half of our vulnerability.
For sure. No, point very well taken, Diane. Yeah. And Sagar, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that particular one before we move on to, I think, Brandon's question next, and we'll loop in one other to that.
I think the perspective I have is going to come from a very academic angle on it. So from an academic conference point of view, so there's a conference that's been running for about 17, 18 years called Intelligence and Security Informatics. Initially, it was designed for doing AI, ML-based topics for security applications, more broadly speaking, homeland security applications. So, border security, for example, would be a topic that fell into that. But increasingly, we're starting to see the development of more AI for cyber related venues rather than folks submitting directly towards that ISI conference, simply because there are enough differences between the concept of homeland security versus cybersecurity that people found it meaningful enough to distinguish the two in terms of just the academic venues as a whole. Now, that may just be the nature of the academy as a whole, but it does signify that there is enough differences that people are seeing that requires a different set of venues to present knowledge about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. No, thank you so much, Sagar. Fantastic. And Brandon asked there in the chat about, the extent to which we need a grand theory of cyber behavior or cyber war. And do we need that in such a way as to, in fact, organize some of our research efforts here? And, I'm wondering, perhaps we could use that as a bit of a launching pad to talk about, barriers to researching, cybersecurity, particularly from an interdisciplinary perspective at IU, but also just across the academy. So I'm wondering, maybe we'll just take a similar order this time around, but maybe starting with maybe Jean, with you this time first, and just you can reflect on the extent to which you think we need to have some more organizing principles. In other words, perhaps some end goal, in mind, as well as what other barriers besides, perhaps a lack of conceptual clarity there that are holding back, effective interdisciplinary research in this space, if indeed you feel like it is.
I before I say that, I want to point out Barbara Cherry's question about if there's going to be regulation, what should the forum be for engagement?
Oh, yeah.
Before we move to research and
Please.
teaching, if you don't mind.
Please, that's fine. Yep. Sorry, I missed Barbara. I
think that the courts are limited in their ability to do that. I am very excited about the FTC's commitment to kind of solving the lemons problem on security and privacy. And I think that will go a long way to the problems that are generated by bad coding. But I'm very, end user focused. I'm very consumer focused. So,
why would it be a USA government regulation rather than something that's international?
Which is another, perhaps the
OECD.
OECD.
You're muted again.
Yeah, not to get into the politics, but but the interdisciplinary, I think that Scott and I and Diane have all been struggling. I think some of you have been on that discussion with creating the next generation of scholars. I think if we could have university classes, so it's very hard to advise students. It's hard for them to find out where they contribute to security. If you're not, you don't have to be, with the advances in AI software, you don't have to be great at programming to do AI. If you're not good at secure programming, you shouldn't do it. In fact, I think that even, I think that just the basic, how do you schedule interdisciplinary programs? How do you, we've never been able to integrate criminal science. We've been trying to do that for years. How do you prepare for people to be citizens in the greatest tradition of liberal arts? Because without the grad students and without the scholars, it's hard to do research.
Thank you so much, Jean. Yeah, and Diane. And let's bring Asaf and Sagar into this. There's several questions on the table now, so please feel free to reflect and pontificate on what should be, perhaps more effective regulators, or indeed, as Barbara's pointing out, giving the FTC perhaps even more authority, especially in light of recent Supreme Court rulings in this space. And if you want to go the OECD route or other multilateral fora, for sure, please do. And also, you can feel free to discuss any barriers that you've experienced, perhaps, in your own kind of journey researching cybersecurity. So perhaps Asif, will start with you, and then Sagar. That's a lot.
I'll take a crack at both questions. For
Yeah.
the first one, I think I'm biased because I teach and research insurance and torts. And because of that, I am fascinated by private ordering. And I am interested in understanding deeper whether or not we can rely, and to what extent and in what areas, on duties of care as they relate to your obligations to engage in certain reasonable cybersecurity measures. And can we rely on entities like insurance companies to ensure compliance with those standards on a market or industry level? And then government regulation steps in order to identify and address market failures and enhance and incentivize better cybersecurity practices on the part of private entities. That is, of course, separate from some of the points that Diane has raised when what happens when the government is the one who's failing, when a city, county, sheriff department is not doing enough. And so how do we regulate them? And that is indeed a complicated matter. And I think that multiple incidents now have indicated that many of our public entities are not well equipped to address cybersecurity threats. So I do think that to answer Barbara's question, part of the answer in my mind is inevitable just because of the issues of scale. We'll have to involve certain private ordering. So it's not through the courts, it's not through an expert agency, it's through private entities doing better. To the second point, I just want to mention, I'm writing a book on teaching cybersecurity law and policy. I think some of you have heard me say this before. As part of that book, what I've kind of really focused on is try to identify the way we teach cybersecurity law across law schools and some non-law schools programs across the United States. And there's massive discrepancies in the way we teach these materials, and as a result in the way we research these materials. So to go back to Brendan's question, I think that there is a need for us to coalesce around certain sets of parameters, even if broadly defined, even if to a degree flexible, because I also understand that every time you create a curriculum is political by default. It's exclusive and inclusive. It excludes certain parts and includes other parts, but it impacts siloing. It impacts our ability to conduct research in an effective way, and in teaching these materials to the future generations that will be doing this work. So part of what my book attempts to do is to try and identify what are areas where we can coalesce around, what are areas where we are massively disagreeing on as being part of cybersecurity, in my case, law and policy, but can just as well be cybersecurity in other contexts. And how do we conceptualize questions in our research unit, as Brendan called it, to try and map out better where we have gaps and where we have inability to better collaborate.
Very helpful. Thank you, Asaf. And I'm looking forward to that book. and Sagar, any reflections that you care to share?
Yeah, I'm not going to be as brave as Asaf and try to answer both questions. I'll just answer the second one, more in my wheelhouse here. But some of the barriers in terms of the area that I work in particular in AI for cyber, is undoubtedly number one is data set access and sharing. So that is a significant issue in terms of many students and many researchers trying to get involved in this area. And so the best description I had about data sets, publicly accessible data sets, was from one of my friends at the NSA, Josiah Dijkstra, who's actually at SFS alum. He said that a lot of the data sets out there are old and crusty, and I can't think of a better way of describing that, because cybersecurity is such a unique domain. It's rapidly evolving, and the data sets are so adversarial in nature. You need some of the newer and emerging data sets to handle that. And so the way that I always answer that question, in terms of if a grad student comes to me and says, hey, how do I try and do AI for cyber related work? And I think that IU does a tremendous job in this space, is Number one, go ahead and be creative. In terms of where you can get your data from. A lot of the data sets that are accessible publicly are more NetFlow data, log file data, spam data, phishing data, and so on. What I call really generation one of cybersecurity data. But really, if we look at a lot of the data that is driving computational propaganda and disinformation, for example, that's all publicly accessible. You can access that through Facebook API, Twitter API, and so on, right? So you don't need a publicly accessible data set that can actually give you those types of facilities. And then second is try to identify entities such as the Research SOC or OmniSOC here at Indiana University that are willing to share the data and willing to actually provide the data that is in a realistic operational environment that could be used in a particular context. So that's, I think, the number one barrier to entry or challenge that I've seen personally within the space that I work in is data set access and acquisition, and also sharing as well. I'd like to also comment about the interdisciplinary aspect for one moment here as well. I think a lot of the work that I do is I've been called a computer scientist hanging out in a business school. And I take that as a double-edged sword, actually, a backhanded compliment to an extent, right? Because the computer scientists, their game is to publish in conferences and top-tier ACM, IEEE venues, and that type of thing. But then in a business school, we're focused on peer-reviewed journal articles and FT50, UTD-24, and so on and so forth. So I think the two comments I have about the interdisciplinary nature is that it is possible to do. I personally do it myself, and I take great pride in the fact that a lot of my collaborations are interdisciplinary in nature. But the two things that I think have helped contributed to that is understanding what are the motivations for both disciplines in terms of their progression through the field, and playing to those very smartly and very intelligently. And then number two, it's very simple and very, very basic, is just going to the others' meetings and conferences and listening. And listening first, then talking after about what are the real problems and that type of thing, and bringing something to the table for both sets of communities. To me, those are the two parts of the interdisciplinary aspect of cybersecurity that I've found to be personally very useful.
Thank you so much, Sagar. And we're pretty much out of time. So how about we'll just finish up with maybe some closing thoughts in the form of a quick lightning round. And so you can feel free to reflect on anything that's been said, of course. And I'm happy to see some hopeful research connections already being made in the chat box there, which was one of the outcomes that we were hoping from this exercise. But how do ethical considerations and normative concerns, how do those impact your research agenda? And maybe we'll start with Eugene, if it's okay, again, just briefly here. And I was struck by one thing you said, that if we're trying to protect everything, we're not going to protect anything, right? And that comes up, in the IoT context, for sure. It comes up in the critical infrastructure debate, if everything's critical as anything. So I'm wondering, from an ethical, from a cybersecurity perspective, how should we be thinking about that triage? And does that influence your own research at all, perhaps?
I am going to be brief because I feel like I believe that ethical engineering is good engineering. Mm-hmm. That when you do something that is well suited to the challenge at hand and uses the least amount of data and protects the person's autonomy, you're going to have the most optimized, the most personalized, the most ethical, and the best engineering. So
no, that's fair. No, thank you so much, Jean. Wonderful. And Diane, yes, no, same question to you. And any other closing reflections you'd like to provide, of course. I think you might
you're talking ethics, and I think that ethics hasn't caught up with where the technology is, and that's part of the problem. So when we talk about the ethical world, we're talking from a completely different situation where you can talk about individual behavior and individual decision making, but that's not really true anymore. And what I do, if I do it online, could have impacts far beyond what I ever imagined. And so I think we need to either rethink ethics then, or we probably just, if you're talking ethics, I think we need to rethink ethics within a different framework.
And on that point, Asaf, that's something you're working on. So any closing thoughts or reflections from you?
Yeah, it really much ties with what Diane just said. I think part of the problem is that we don't have ethical answers to many of the most devastating areas of the application of technology in society, and even especially in the areas of national security, which has also been a common theme in today's panel. There's a lot of questions of what the ethical answer is. And where I'm most intrigued is, as a lawyer, is the intersectionality of then ethics with normative regulatory frameworks. And if we don't understand what the moral thing to do is, how can we then articulate it in a law that expects positive behavior moving forward? I'll just give one example of which I think is a terrific one, is ransomware payments. Do we pay or do we not pay ransom is an ethical question. And I don't think that, the DOJ just literally created a task force last week, but I'd be very curious to see if they come up with an answer on exactly this point. And I think this demonstrates perfectly that we are so far behind on the ethical analysis that then to suggest any kind of regulation becomes difficult to do.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Asaf. And it gives us some marching orders in academia, right? And then Sagar, please take us home.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for coordinating this panel and putting it together. I think it's doing a lot of the things that you're talking about with some of these questions, forging interdisciplinary relationships, bringing these concerns to light and so on. So again, thank you for that. I think my comments about the ethics part is very much related to what Jean had mentioned, being able to identify what are the situations wherein something will be deployed, using the minimum data available to do that, and then thinking carefully about the ramifications and the adverse effects of technology in that particular situation and beyond that as well. Those are all different things that I personally try to inject in my research. Like, what's the end user? What's the data that I really, really need? Like, that's the nice to have, but what's the really thing that I need here to do the analysis? And then thinking about, after I develop the system, what are the adverse effects of it? So personally, that's the way I approach it. I think, echoes some of what Jean's thoughts are in that space as well.
Excellent. No, thanks, Sagar. And please join me in thanking all of our distinguished faculty members here for joining us on this research roundtable. We really, really appreciate it. This is such a busy time of term, so we're incredibly thankful. And then just lastly, a quick note, we're assembling reading lists as part of this exercise. So if any of you, of course, any panelists, but any of the attendees as well know of readings that you would suggest at this intersection of cybersecurity, national security, and ethics that you think should be included, please just reach out and we'll make sure to include those on this list that we're generating so that other universities can benefit too. So thank you all so much again. Best of luck with the end of term, with winding everything up. Be safe, be well. I hope you have a wonderful, well-deserved, relaxing summer and a productive one. So thanks so much, everybody. And thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, guys.